Hi, my name is Mirek Stoli. Today I'm going to talk about some possible research projects pertaining to the learning of board game rules. Board games are huge right now, and with good reason. They're fun, they got lots of tactile bits, and they're social. Educators might use board games to teach socio-emotional skills, like fair negotiation and conflict resolution. And researchers have also designed board games to teach specific course content, like organic chemistry. A problem with board games, though, is that their systems just do not work if you don't know the rules. Pandemic Iberia is a cooperative board game in which players try to cure 4 diseases during a global pandemic. At the end of each player turn, players draw cards from the infection deck, which shows which cities get infection cubes. If a city already has 3 infection cubes in it, though, instead of putting a 4th cube, they trigger an outbreak, increasing the outbreak tracker by 1. All of those steps simply do not happen if players don't know to do them, so players have to know the rules before the game even works. So if educators want to teach with board games, they ultimately have to learn how to teach board games. I've identified 4 areas that researchers from industry and academia could work on to make the process of learning board games easier. A typical group dynamic, and that which you might find in a classroom setting, has one player teaching the rest of the players how to play the game. So one player will gather up all their friends, sit them down, and teach them the rules of the game. Teaching board game rules is a specific type of teaching. Industry folks and hobbyists have honed their craft teaching hundreds of games, and many of them have decided to compile this knowledge in the form of blog posts and videos online. An existing research project in this area would be Sato and Haan's applying an experiential learning model to the teaching of gateway strategy board games. Another research project in this area might evaluate some of this advice. Many of the posts advise teachers to start by teaching the objective of the game. Advice like this may be empirically validated by running comparative studies. The number one advice for almost all of these blogs is that you have to learn the game yourself before you can teach it. Which sounds obvious, but what it means is that if we trace back who taught who, far back enough, eventually, someone had to learn the game from the rulebook. And in our group, it's always me. So how do we write rulebooks in such a way that it's easy for players to learn from them? Rulebooks can be long, dense, and full of technical terms and examples. But rulebooks have a tough job. They have to be able to teach you the game by reading through it, but also they have to serve as a sort of code of laws. Players might need to look up a specific rule, or they might not be able to remember everything, so they're going to have to return to it. So rulebooks also have to be able to be referenced easily. In order to accommodate these 2 functions, publisher Fantasy Flight recently started splitting their rulebooks into a learn-to-play guide and a rules reference, 2 separate rulebooks for those 2 purposes. So rulebooks are another area where empirical methods might be useful. Does splitting the rulebook into a learning-to-play guide and a rules reference help develop players' understanding in the long term? In addition to looking at the sort of macro structure of the rulebook, researchers might also look more closely at the way rulebooks are written and what kind of techniques they use to teach their content. One previous researcher in this area, Ibrahim Yücel, wrote an article called Rules for Writing Rules, in which he applied instructional design to the writing of rulebooks. Some things he talked about were figures, examples, and how flowcharts might help people understand the systems. One way researchers might build on Yücel's work is by digging more into the use of worked examples in board game rulebooks. A worked example is when instructions provide a step-by-step process on how to complete a task. Examples in board game rulebooks may be considered worked examples, and drawing from that body of research may help us improve these examples so that they communicate the rules more effectively to the players. So we can improve rulebooks and our own personal teaching methods, but maybe there's another way to approach this problem entirely. If we look at video games, they have interactive tutorials that teach game mechanics over time. Some analog game creators have attempted to recreate this effect. We can use the game Fog of Love as one example. Fog of Love comes with tutorial cards seeded throughout all the decks so that you can learn the mechanics throughout the playing of the first game as those rules come up. The company Dized designed a phone app featuring digital tutorials meant to be used in conjunction with the physical pieces to learn the rules throughout the first game session. Anderson et al. Identified useful features of video game tutorials, such as context sensitivity, which is the providing of information when you need it, rather than having to go to an outside source. In the future, researchers in this area might look at other features of digital tutorials that might be applied to analog games, and how they might do so. So, we've established that learning games can be difficult. But luckily, we don't have to start with square one. As we play games, learning new ones becomes easier. We can call this research area progression. In a video game, levels become more difficult as the game goes on to match the increasing skill of the player. We see a similar approach in board games like Agricola and Magic Maze that feature multiple levels of complexity through which the players progress. Players build on their previous knowledge and add new mechanics through playing the game multiple times. But we can also think about progression between different board games. Games have similarity in their rules, and a familiarity with one game might make it easier to learn a similar game. After learning Pandemic, moving your character around the board in Eldritch Horror using actions might feel familiar, while other mechanics like the dice resolutions would feel new. How can players take advantage of their growing knowledge of mechanics so they can learn new games without feeling overwhelmed? Hobbyists often call games like Ticket to Ride gateway games because they have fewer barriers to entry in terms of complexity. We can imagine a player going through a series of increasingly complex games, starting with Ticket to Ride, that eventually gives them the knowledge and the confidence they need to learn the 12-hour behemoth Twilight Imperium. To generate such a progression, we might draw from research from another area. Butler et al. Applied research on intelligent tutoring systems to automate level progression in a digital puzzle game. Researchers might apply a similar technique using data from the board game database BoardGameGeek. Each board game on BoardGameGeek features a weight value, meant to track its complexity. This ranges from 0 to 5, with 5 being the most complex. BoardGameGeek also has data on which mechanics are present in which games. Researchers could use this data to create a computational system that generates a progression of games, increasing in weight and keeping track of which mechanics players are familiar with so they can add new mechanics over time. So researchers, both in industry and academia, could look at these 4 areas: teaching, rulebooks, tutorials, and progression. Research in this area could help educators use games in their classrooms, designers make their games more accessible, and players play more games. Thank you for watching.